Have you ever noticed how a blurred background makes a subject stand out, just like a portrait? Or seen landscape images with clarity from the foreground through to the background? The level of clarity in the background is something we photographers call depth of field. When all of the image is in focus, from the foreground to the background, we have a deep depth of field. And when only the foreground is in focus, we have a shallow depth of field. So, how do we control depth of field? We have a number of controls at hand, and the first we should take a look at is the aperture. An aperture is the central hole created by an iris in the lens. It controls the amount of light entering the camera by opening and closing. This is where you can find aperture readings on your camera. Aperture readings are a series of strange-looking numbers beginning with an F. What is even stranger, the bigger the F number, the smaller the aperture. And the smaller the number, the larger the aperture. Let's look at an example to make the F numbers a little easier to understand. Think of F numbers as a number of slices you can cut from a whole pizza. Take two examples, F2 and F22. At F2, we cut the whole pizza into two slices, which gives us two very large slices of pizza. At F22, we cut the whole pizza into 22 slices, giving us 22 very small slices of pizza. So, F2 is larger than F22. It's that easy. Using different aperture settings will have a dramatic effect on your photos. Big apertures, such as f2, f2.8, or f4, will create a shallow depth of field with a blurred background. While small apertures, like f16 or f22, create a deep depth of field with a sharp background. We have a couple of other tricks up our sleeve to help control depth of field. Both the focal length of the lens we use and the shooting distance from our subject can affect our depth of field. Let's look at focal length first. Focal length varies when you zoom. The more you zoom in, the longer the focal length. The more you zoom out, the shorter the focal length. At any given aperture setting, if we increase or decrease the focal length, we will affect the depth of field. Take a look at these two examples. Both are shot at an aperture of f5.6. Our first image with a focal length of 16mm has a much sharper background, while our second image at 200mm has a blurred background. The other way we can affect our depth of field is to vary the distance from our subject. In these examples, we keep our focal length and aperture consistent using 70mm at f5.6. Notice how the background is blurred, yet as we move progressively further away from the subject, the background, while not becoming 100% clear, is becoming more recognizable. Blurring the background is great when you want to make the subject stand out. This is a good technique when photographing still life subjects such as plants, flowers, or even insects. It is also particularly useful when you want to draw the viewer's attention to the subject, or maybe when you have a messy background that you want to make less recognizable. Sharp backgrounds are great when you want to create a sense of space and capture the depth as our eyes see it. They are particularly useful when shooting landscapes, travel photos, and general photos of people and the environment. So grab your camera and let's take a hands-on approach. To have best control of depth of field, set your exposure mode to Aperture Priority. Now, let's try to create a soft, defocused background while shooting a portrait. We need to set our aperture to the biggest f number that our lens will allow. Next, zoom in as far as your lens will allow you to. Finally, make sure you are focused on the main subject. The eyes are important in a good portrait, so try focusing on them. Notice how defocused your image is in the background. You have the desired shallow depth of field effect. Let's have a quick recap of the things we've learnt today. What is depth of field? How aperture, focal length, and distance from subject all affect the depth of field. And finally, in what situations do we use various depth of field settings? Now that you're familiar with depth of field, make sure you check out the other tutorials in the series and see how else you can take creative control of your camera.